Compliance is a profession where people work tirelessly to make the world a better place. And there are hundreds of amazing and inspiring women who have helped the field develop into what it is today. Great Women in Compliance is part of the Compliance Podcast Network, so join Mary, Shirley, and Lisa Fine as they talk with women in compliance who are making a difference.
Welcome to the Great Women in Compliance Podcast with Mary, Shirley, and Lisa Fine. We are on the Compliance Podcast Network, and you can find our landing page at Corporate Compliance Insights. Today, we have what Mary calls a bonus episode. And as we are on the U.S., and this is going to be released on the eve of Thanksgiving, I'm really thankful for both this guest and this episode. I am speaking with Kris Brown. She's the president of Brady, which is the leading advocacy group in the United States to end gun violence. And you may be wondering now how that relates to the Great Women in Compliance podcast. Well, as Kris will tell you more about her background, it really includes the role of Chief Legal Officer at gategroup, and that's Gate Gourmet and Airline Catering, where she built the compliance program, among many other things she did there, including the values, the mission, some other things. She came up with the strategy, she implemented it, and she worked to build the compliance culture. After gategroup, she went back to her first passion, which was advocacy, and that led her to Brady. While a lot of us have found a forever profession in the ethics and compliance world, Kris is a great example of something people ask about a lot, life after compliance, and how you can take what you're doing now for a future experience. And for full disclosure, I've known Kris for more years than I want to admit, and probably the time length of some of our youngest podcast listeners. And she's a friend and a mentor, a colleague, and really my work spouse for life. And without her, I don't know if I would have ended up in the ethics and compliance world. So I am very thankful for that, for your friendship, and also for your guidance into this career in this world. So with that, Kris, thanks. Can you talk a little bit about your background, your career path, and what made you get more involved in compliance and focus on it?
Absolutely. I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you for inviting me on. And I'm a big fan of your podcast. So thanks for all that you're doing to really amplify and tell the stories of so many incredible people in the world of compliance, which years ago was kind of a nascent profession and has really exploded, I think, for all of the right reasons. And now I forgot your first question, Lisa.
How did you get into compliance? And how did you start getting involved in it in your time, either before we were at Gate together, and just a little bit about your career, how you got there?
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's a roundabout tale, like most of the tales in my life, to be honest. I graduated college and worked on Capitol Hill for many years. I was a legislative assistant to a member of Congress in the House of Representatives. I went to law school at night. I clerked for a judge and was a lawyer doing mainly litigation, but other kinds of legal representation as well. And compliance was not really something that I materially did as a lawyer, but I touched on it in all kinds of different ways. One of the ways we did that, of course, lawyers consult on issues of compliance with the law in all that we do. For me, I started off as a regulatory lawyer and then really switched to litigation. A lot of what I saw piecing together before I went to my next career was, on the one side, companies who were really trying to get it right. And on the other side, companies who really got it wrong and they were being sued. So that drove the point home that compliance is very important. And I landed kind of serendipitously at Gate. That's an airline catering, provisioning and logistics company that's international, based in Zurich, Switzerland. And one of the first issues that I was given task as general counsel of the Americas at the time was really moving forward with a more robust compliance framework within Gate. And so, like any general counsel looking at this, the way I learned was by tapping into the expertise of other lawyers who really helped me understand what are the business risks, how do we go about solving these things, and provided a lot of stepping stones for me to be able to understand what kind of structure needed to be put in place that was actually workable for Gate. And I would say the one thing that I really took away from my experience working with the business side of what we do is the importance of understanding the nuts and bolts of the business and what businesses are really all about, supply chain and everything else, in implementing a compliance program. And I found it fascinating, really, really interesting, and obviously still apply pieces of that understanding it, albeit in a very, very different dimension, leading a gun violence prevention organization.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think learning about the business is one of the most important parts, I think, of anywhere you're working. Understand the people, what motivates them, what the concerns are. I think that's been from when you and I, or particularly you, started in the compliance area. I think there's been a real shift and a move forward. There's still a ways to go. And before we talk a little bit more about your time at gategroup and some of the focus on the compliance that was sort of forced on you there, can we talk a little bit about how you ended up at Brady and what you're doing now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was at gategroup for 7 or 8 years. If you look back at my career, I'm mostly in places for 7 or 8 years is how it has turned out. And as you noted in your introduction of me, Lisa, I found myself itching over time to get back in an advocacy role. I started out there. I grew up in a very political household. We were always very engaged in campaigns and causes. When I was living overseas in Switzerland, obviously with GATE, one of the first questions I got asked, no matter where someone was from, no matter their race, gender, or anything else, when they found out I was American, was what's up with gun violence in America. And so when I moved back to the United States, I really took that issue on, that and climate change, as one of the two issues I really wanted to devote some time and energy to trying to solve, honestly, and being a part of the solution. And as it happens, the member of Congress that I worked for approached me and said, hey, Brady needs someone to help them with their strategy, which I did do. They hired me as a consultant. And then one thing led to the other. And I ended up being asked by the board to be co-president and then president of this organization. It really is the honor of a lifetime to work on this cause. Because it's so tied to everything I believe in about the kind of country that I want to live in and that I want my 2 daughters, Katie and Sophia, to inherit.
Yes. And at another moment of full disclosure, Katie and Sophia are people that will be taking care of me throughout my life as well. So we want a good world for them so they can take care of us both. Yeah, they're pretty clear on that. They're wonderful, wonderful girls and women now. So with that, so let's talk, we're going to probably go back to Brady a little more, but let's talk a little bit about gategroup. And when I started at gategroup, I remember very clearly about 6 weeks later, we were in a meeting where we were all told we had to not look at our phones. And I was thinking, what a great place for great meeting etiquette. Turns out, and we were meeting with some outside counsel. I was still so excited to be there, brand new. I'd known a little bit about what they call the fraud incident, but it was a major, perfect storm of compliance issues, which led to the CEO's resignation. And apparently that was going to be public in the middle of this meeting. And you were aware of that. So you didn't want us all to, get sidetracked from whatever important thing we were doing at that moment. But with that said, can you talk a little bit about that, that incident? It's publicly in the news and sort of how it impacted you, GATE, and your world of growing a compliance program.
Well, it was quite the jolt for an organization that, has, at the time, I think our global revenue was around $3 billion per year. And just to give your listeners a sense, the footprint of GATE was that we had operated in 180 countries. And as an airline catering and logistics provider, obviously that means we have units, we have personnel in units all across the country, about 30,000 employees at the time. So this was a very labor-intensive enterprise. But while we were operating this business, which was essentially based on entering long-term contracts with airlines who would pay us for those services on a fee system set in the contract, and we would provide those services. the airline industry was going through, well, it always goes through tumult, but a major change and shift in a new business enterprise. And that was retail on board. And it really reversed or turned on its head the economics of how the airline industry worked, or the catering and airline industry relationship. And that's because in that model, the caterer themselves determines what to put on board, what the cost price structure is. Essentially, the flight attendants are the line agents of selling the product, and the caterer collects all of the money related to each flight and then pays the airline a certain amount. So it's just a completely different business model. This fraud, this is a long explanation, but I think it's really important to understand why this was a compliance issue, because I've thought a lot about this. This fraud was perpetrated by a woman named Amanda Jacobson. It's a crazy, crazy story in its essence that deserves like 5 different podcasts, because she was out of central casting. If you ever saw the movie Catch Me If You Can, that's Amanda Jacobson. She had like 6 identities, all of which were fraudulent. So lesson number 1 was screen your employees, which hadn't really happened here. But beyond that, she was in charge of Gates' retail operations, the buy on board operations in Denmark. And over a period of 7 years, she stole $25 million. And that's material based on our operations at the time. And as a publicly traded company at the time on the Swiss Stock Exchange, we had to disclose that information. And it was a huge undertaking. You can imagine working with our chief financial officer, trying to understand the scope and scale of this fraud, working my boss, Human Yazari at the time, who was the chief legal officer. I assumed that role later. I mean, it was 24/7 for all of legal to do the investigations, to understand the scope and scale of this fraud, to report it, and then help with the prosecution of this woman. So it was a really big deal and got us probably really on the path to a completely different way of looking at compliance within the business enterprise, within all of these countries where we operated, and really understand how to manage the risk of that kind of fraud from ever happening again.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, too, there was people risk that comes as a result of this, in part because she, if anybody got a little closer to any of this, she managed to either isolate or terminate all the things that we talk about in compliance now, from hotlines and from other things that were, have grown in popularity. It was ability of controls, people able to mess with controls, and a lot of different things like that.
Yeah, if I think about it in one way, one of the tales here, or one of the lessons that I take away is making sure that regardless of how much someone ingratiates themselves to management or more senior leadership, the same set of rules have to apply to everyone. And what happened, I think, ultimately is that too much discretion was given to this individual. Less people who were reporting to her did call and did say things about her, but she would manipulate or move her way out of it. And ultimately, what she was doing before she was finally caught was really trying to, shred all evidence of this, make sure that folks didn't know. It didn't help a whole lot when we went to the bank that was processing all of the cash for Miss Jacobson, and the tellers told us, oh, well, she would bring it in and then she would leave with a black bag of extra cash. And so it was very clear that she was not properly reporting the amount of money that was made on each flight. She was skimming the amount off. And for someone who made, a decent, reasonable salary, it was another major note that she was living in a multi-million-dollar mansion on the lake in Copenhagen. So just so much came out, and it was a black mark, obviously, that gategroup ultimately moved past very well, but a black mark for many people who were in senior leadership. And that was the other lesson, that even the people who were not directly involved who tried to do all of the right thing, there's an aftershock associated with this that really takes down everyone, which is why I think compliance is so critically important, because you can't take back the reputational damage in some of these events easily at all. It took years and years and years.
Well, a little bit after that, as you mentioned earlier, you assumed the role of chief legal officer, and I personally remember being a part of, is you recognized, as the whole organization did, the need for a compliance program, that was more intense and more centralized. So you went about essentially figuring out a way to build that. So how did you kind of take a look at that and start with, I often think about the adage, never waste a good crisis. At this point, we passed the aftershocks, but there was a need for building this, a function, or, what would work for the organization. So that was the way of asking, what steps did you then take when everyone had identified this need? Then you had to make it a reality.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that became clear to me when I was general counsel of the Americas is that the U.S. at the time, and this was in the early 2000s, well, mid 2000s, was really leading the world and thinking about compliance and taking it quite seriously. So I would raise issues around compliance with my boss, and he would say, "Oh, that's really interesting. Put a policy together and we'll make that global." And he was always up for any of my ideas about how we could, make a case for why this is good for business and makes good sense to do and mitigates risk. So I had a long track record, probably 2 or 3 years, of doing those kinds of activities, whether that's setting up a global hotline that ultimately you really pushed through, Lisa, or making sure that there were processes and consistency for how claims against the company were investigated, either employee claims or external claims. To put it nicely, some of what I was able to implement was the lowest of low-hanging fruit. But a big part of my, top-down sort of approach was creating tone at the top. So I spent a lot of time getting to know the other colleagues I had in the C-suite, getting very close to our CEO, and helping convince him about why tone at the top, why communication around standards, why creating our values, which I did help create when I was the chief legal officer. I recall, Lisa, you and another colleague of ours helped finalize those values that were
recommended. That's one of my favorite gate memories.
Me too.
Also, over time, I do remember that sometimes, when we'd have a particularly difficult day, I would reinterpret the same words with Minions or Beastie Boys lyrics or things like that. It's a little bit more, nerdy. I should have known then I'd end up in ethics and compliance forever, because I was way more amused by that than anybody else.
I was amused by that too. And I recall our fondness for alliteration. I don't think that the values ended up being quite as alliterative as we might have liked, but it was a really fun process because we knew we were putting the scaffolding in that both would drive compliance forward, but also clarity in the business. And I will say what was essential to the success of this and cascading down throughout 30,000 employees, which was mind-boggling for me to go into units all across the world. I remember going into a unit in Japan, and they had the values pictorially demonstrated on all of the walls. They had painted them. And I almost wanted to cry, because that made me understand, wow, this thing that we had put together that we knew was an essential element of tone at the top. Obviously, it was much more complicated than just the values, but they're core and important to compliance. All of the units had taken them and made them their own. And to personalize that and to personalize the role of compliance, make people understand why it's important, I think is so critically important. What I would say about my takeaway on it in general of that experience is there are a lot of people selling a lot of things to me when I was chief legal officer. Hey, put this system in. Hey, and I would always ask, how's that going to help our business actually comply? because we have people doing a lot of other different things. And I would always get so frustrated when people would try to sell me something that A, I didn't think that would work, and that B, reflected no diligence on their part of our actual business. And I'm sure that happens all the time. But I think real compliance is figuring out how your business operates, where the true risks are, and then tailoring and designing a program around that. And that was the funnest part of the job for me in many respects is that work.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely. I'd hate to break it to you, but I think we still have that same situation where we often have vendors who will do, at least I find, one of two things. Either they will not know anything about the business or decide that they know more about the business than I do and start, explaining to me what our business is doing. And there are a lot of excellent vendors and people out there who do that right. But sometimes it's like, would it be so hard to just ask me what my biggest concerns are and then respond? It's an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, I can imagine. And that's so frustrating. And I do think that folks who really just spend a little bit of time trying to understand how it is that someone like you could really advance compliance in your organization with these tools, boy, that would be a unique conversation. I never had those with folks.
I will say I do have them now, and I feel very fortunate. They're not necessarily people I may be using now or next week, but I remember. So I'm always like, play the long game with somebody like me, because I will much more remember, someone who's not pushing me, so it's their next quarter of sales versus someone who's trying to learn about me, get to know me, and get to know, more importantly, the business I'm working in and what works and what doesn't. And especially the people who say, we have this great solution, but it won't work for you. I respect that.
Oh my gosh.
That's
amazing. That is the best.
So I'm going to ask one more thing about the Gate Gourmet experience. And then I want to talk a little bit about, your changes from in the midst of the compliance to out of there, which is, what were your biggest cultural challenges? I mean, I remember some of mine being, and still have some in a global company, but how did you address that in building a program?
That's such a great question, because I think that, first of all, obviously Gate had an international footprint. We operated, I think, in 180 different countries. What am I saying? But we had 30,000 employees. And so the cultural challenges are obvious when you're talking about different languages, different ways of doing business, different internalizations of risk in different cultures. There's a lot written about that, and that's real, that you have to kind of internalize. How you talk about these issues with employees can often vary from country to country. But part of it too, honestly, is thinking about the top 100 or 150 employees and thinking about how to really engage them and make sure they are focusing with their teams and cascading down compliance in a real way. And the cultural issue that I had at first there was, why should I pay attention to this? Why does this matter? Because for a long time in the business operations, the way, and I'm not picking on Gate, because I think many, many companies were like this and many still are, I just want to stay under the radar and do business and grow in a way that I always have. And anyone who's telling me that I have to fill out this extra form or watch this video for training is just wasting my time. So part of what we had to do is switch the culture from one where compliance was viewed just as a cost to where compliance was viewed as imperative to actually secure business. I do think a big and important component of this is also the shift of other vendors in contractually requiring and forcing bidding around compliance. And I think much more of that should happen. A lot of this can happen and be reinforced with appropriate provisions in contracts and the supply chain.
I think right now we do a lot of, we at all companies are very concerned about their business partners' codes, our supply chain. I mean, that becomes more and more. I mean, I think that becomes a huge part of it. And a lot of people in this field are talking a lot about, when we were at Gate, it was CSR, now it's ESG,
Right.
You've always got an acronym. So with that, I'm going to move on. You will leave from Gate because as you can tell now, you were really engaged and involved in compliance and ethics. And I talk a lot about ethical decision-making, helping people make the right choices as opposed to talking about regulations as well.
Yeah.
I think that's a shift in the field too, which I think has been great. But I know that when you left Gate, you spent we talked a little about it before. You spent a lot of time figuring out what did you want to do next. I talked a little before, but a little more about how did you go through the process? I know you had the, gun violence and climate change as big causes for you, but how did you start thinking about this in terms of your short-term kind of break from the corporate world to coming back in some form? And how did you get there in your thought process?
I'd like to say that I wrote it down on a piece of paper and clear and demonstrably, effective 5-step plan, but that would be a lie. A big part of what I did was something that I'd never given myself the space to do really in my life, because each job that I had from one to the next, from the first job after college until Gate, had to some extent fallen into my lap. And that's neither good nor bad, but simply a fact. Literally, I got the job at Gate because I was walking down the hall at the firm where we both worked, Lisa, Weil, Gottschall, and Manges, and the managing partner said, "Hey, you," because he'd just been called by a client, Gate, to see if a general counsel could be seconded. And I was the person he saw walking down the hall. And that's how
I think it was a little more than that. I think
it may have been more than that. But I mean, to me, it was, I was at the law firm. I didn't look for another job. And then I landed in this job that really made my life and career in many respects. But once I decided to leave Switzerland and take some time to sort of be with my girls and be more of a full-time mom, I gave myself the space for about 3 months really not to think about it and just make sure, hey, these things that you want to do that are actually really hard, climate change, gun violence in America, do you want to do them? And I remember having conversations with you about that. It's very different. It's very hard. And it's a departure from the rest of my career where it was really sort of a progression from one thing to the next. But it was something that wouldn't leave me and something that I really cared about. When I thought about it some more, it really offered me the opportunity to work in a way that drew upon all of my experience. And that's the part that I love the most about it. And I'm so glad I did take the time because I worked on Capitol Hill. I care about policy. I care about advocacy. I spent almost 8 years of my life doing that. I'm a lawyer. I'm trained as a lawyer, trained as a litigator. I'm a problem solver. I love, I love thinking about strategy. That was one of my favorite things to do when I was at Gate. In the role I was privileged enough to have, I was able to do so much thinking around that with really talented and committed people. I wanted to take all of that, and if I could, combine it in some meaningful way and work on something I'm truly passionate about. And if it was hard, and if it was an uphill battle, that made me feel more resolved to work on it because it's important and it matters. And I really wanted to spend more of my life, to be honest, focused on things like that, where I can feel like I'm making a real difference, and not so much, these are worthy and noble professions, but not so much in a corporate environment for a while. And so that's where I ended up. I mean, I could have gone on to become a general counsel in another company. There were those offers that came. I could have thought about something going back to a law firm. And what I would say about it, as attractive as those things were, it didn't speak to me. I allowed my gut to sort of dictate the path forward. And I'm really grateful I gave myself that time. And I think most people, your gut is telling you something, whether you pay attention to it or not, is something else.
Yeah, absolutely.
And giving yourself space to think about these things and understanding, in the words of Marie Kondo, well, what sparks joy how can I use all that I know, all that I've gained in my career to really focus on something that makes it feel like I'm not working? Those are the kinds of questions that I asked myself, and that's how I landed at Brady.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because when I've been through that process a little bit, most recently, I started with a slightly different approach, which was what do I not want? And what,
that's effective too.
Well, it's a straight, because I thought to myself, I knew where I wanted to live. And I thought, it is important to me to be in an organization that has something I'm interested in. I do, like ethics and compliance people, what you're saying really resonates, because I think we are very passionate about the field sometimes. But I also thought, so I ended up in, books and law and learning is pretty much part of my background. I talk about, books probably more than careers lately, because, sometimes you want to not talk about work, especially when work is as significant as some of what you're doing. But I do think I think it is really important, whether you take a break or you don't, for anybody who's thinking about what they're doing now, is this what my gut tells me I want to do, or am I sticking it out for other reasons?
Because I think in our society, we're conditioned, and I understand this, believe me. So I'm no judgment here at all, but almost be too risk averse in these things, because doing something that is not sparking joy, even if it started out that way, if you have conviction and you have something that drives you, that you're passionate about, that you care so much about, you can find ways to do that. And giving yourself time and space to think about that, and even taking a few risks along the way to do that, ideally in mid-career. But I know people who are doing it much later in their career. I've met some of them. They're amazing. It's never too late to think about this, and to think about how so much of your experience could be used in a way that you hadn't thought about to make a career change.
Okay, I'm taking a tremendous amount of your time, so I have two more questions that I want to ask you. Also, though, I want one clarifying point. I know you love what you're doing and you're very passionate about it, but I want everyone to realize it's not rainbows and unicorns every day, is it?
No, it's gun violence in America. And without being tongue-in-cheek, it's a pretty heavy, harrowing issue. That said, the importance of it and the idea that the things that we're working on have the potential to save lives make a big difference in the zing in your step and the alacrity with which you get out of bed in the morning. And that makes a difference in my life.
Yeah, and I think it's huge. I just sometimes find that people think when you're in a life of public service, suddenly it's like this world of gratefulness and gratitude and the alacrity. And let me just say, I know you well enough to know that it's every day. It's not just, a parade of crusading and everyone just stepping in line. But with that, while you're trying to do all of these things to make the world a better place, and I think it's, it's something that I really admire about you. What did you take? I'm turning back to ethics and compliance, but what did you take from your experience in what you did before into your current role now?
Oh my gosh, so much. So one of the things that that Brady has that they didn't have when I joined are values and a pretty rigorous organizational structure for reporting lines, cascading down information throughout the organization, really thinking about structure and process, a very close relationship, incredibly close relationship between me and our CFO for obvious reasons. For people, probably everyone at Brady knows about Amanda Jacobson, for example, the woman who stole $20 million. Sometimes they're like, Kris, you know that we're a $30 million nonprofit. I'm like, I know, but that's not going to happen on my watch. So much of it, it's not so much, we don't have the same bells and whistles. We're not a publicly traded company, but we have nonprofits have a lot of different regulations that we have to comply with and be super attuned to. And a big part of what I've done is think about what are those things, who should own them, mapping that out and being very clear, you own this, which also means you don't own these other things, and creating accountability, not just for those people that we have designated ownership, but for their teams. So there's transparency and knowledge, and it's an ongoing process. But that's been really, really fun to be able to put together. And I never would have known how to do that or, the right way to assign these things if I hadn't worked in that realm of compliance at Gate.
Yeah, that's incredibly helpful. And I think the one thing I wanted to flip it around on you for 1 second is, what do you wish, with all this experience and perspective that you have when you're working with people in ethics and compliance, and what do you wish that we would keep in mind? Because, we can also become very single-minded in pursuit. But what do you wish that you think a good ethics and compliance professional should know or keep in mind?
Well, I'm talking to one of my my most favorite ethics and compliance folks, and I think they should all be more like you.
Okay, well, I would like to say that I'm going to edit that out, but I'm not. But I
don't think you should. But I'll give you the reason why, and it's not just touting my work spouse. It's because when I have an issue, as I have had, as you can imagine, from time to time, that I'm concerned about within Brady and trying to think about the right solution, you're always one of the first calls, if not the first call that I have. And you always ask a lot of really probing and important questions because you want to get to a practical solution. So my larger thing, and this comes from probably who I am, so everyone can discount this a little, that it's the subjective view of Kris, but I do think there's a lot of objective indicia to say this is the right thing, is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I think asking the right questions, understanding here's probably directionally, this is what you need to do, and really figuring out how to make something work within a business enterprise, obviously lawfully, is so critically important, because these questions we wrestle with, that you wrestle with in the compliance world, they're hard. They're really often incredibly hard. But I think the more you probe and the more you get to know the clients and the folks that you're working with, the easier it is to collectively, with input, get to the right answer.
Well, thank you so much for that. And thank you for that compliment. But a lot of that, I think I learned in the Gate Group boot camp. And a lot of that came from you, because I had to answer a lot of your questions. And and I'm going to close with a little anecdote I think I mentioned a few weeks ago, talking about some of my favorite, compliance horror stories. And this one was also in the news. One of my favorite phone calls I ever made to you, because it comes back to the values. We're so excited.
I know which one this is.
The lanyards. Yeah. When you kept saying, have they been distributed? Have they been distributed for Lisa? Have they gotten to India yet? I said, I've been told they have. And then one day I was able to say to you, Kris, I have some good news and some bad news. Good news is I now have confirmation they've been distributed in India. The bad news is 2 of our employees were wearing them in mugshots, which was in a local newspaper, because they were trying to smuggle gold. It wasn't Gates' fault. It wasn't anyone's. It was this small enterprise. But I don't know at that moment if you really wanted to laugh or cry. So I think we just rolled our eyes.
We did. Oh, Gates.
Yeah. And we had so many. We had things at Weil like that. And I will say before I close off, not only are you a dear friend, and I said a lot of nice things before, which I mean every one of them, is I think it talks about the support for women and women throughout their careers. And there's nothing that's more inspiring than having some of your, day one ride or dies that you still can talk to many years later. So for some of you who are starting out, you can realize that the people you think of today as, the people you ask for advice on something you think is mundane or routine, and you end up not only being, work valued colleagues, but your friends for life. And I think that's one part of this community and our community. So Kris, thank you for joining me, and thank you so much for all of that. And I hope everyone in the U.S. has a great Thanksgiving, and everyone who's not in the U.S., Thanksgiving's a good U.S. holiday. So this one you can take a little from us. So thanks again.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Great Women in Compliance. We hope you'll join us in honoring the great women in the compliance field by subscribing to this podcast and leaving a review.